McMichael, and I'm chairman of the Museum of Foundation Board of Directors, and I'm here to welcome you today to this presentation, and I introduce our guest speaker. Former Congressman Jim Marshall represented Georgia's 3rd and subsequent 8th congressional district from 2003 to 2011. And he was the President of the United States Institute of Peace from 2012 until January of this year. He's also the former mayor of the city of Macon, serving from 1995 to 1999. Congressman Marshall joined the United States Army during the Vietnam War. Became an Army Ranger. He earned 2 Bronze Stars, Combat B, and also a Purple Heart. He was later introduced into the prestigious United States Army Ranger Hall of Fame. He is an appointed member of the National Defense Panel, chartered to review the Quadrennial Defense Review, or better known as the QDR. That report has very recently been released. Congressman Marshall is here to discuss the findings and the recommendation. I want you to now please welcome our former Congressman Jim Marshall.
Thanks, Don.
Thank you, sir.
You know, I gave some thought to the order of these slides, put them together. Actually, I put this together yesterday. And what I did contemplate is that this was going to be a discussion. So, as I'm going along and a question occurs to you or you want to make an observation, there are an awful lot of people here who know an awful lot about what we're talking about, and in many instances know a lot more than I do. And so let's just make it a conversation as we go through this, and I'm happy to try and respond to any questions that you have as we move along. So, the major point that the panel wanted to make, and I'm going to make over and over again, is that the Budget Control Act, with its sequestration provisions, that was passed in 2011, as Rick Goddard mentioned when I came in, was really a failure of leadership here in the United States. The parties couldn't resolve their differences. And so they agreed to put it off and to put in front of them such a hurdle that they knew they'd be forced to agree to resolve their differences. They formed a super committee, it was sort of jokingly referred to as, that was bipartisan, that was going to go ahead and come up with the path towards solving our budget woes, our fiscal woes. And the impetus for actually making a decision and making those tough choices was going to be what was going to happen if they didn't. That's the sequestration part of the Budget Control Act. Well, as everybody knows, they've sort of been able to put it off a little bit. They've pumped a little money here, pumped a little money there, but they haven't come together. And the sequestration provisions have come into effect, and they're a disaster. And so what we in the panel decided to do was describe these budget cuts that result from the Budget Control Act of 2011, sequestration provision, as a serious strategic misstep by the United States. And I'll talk a lot more about that. Many of you are familiar with military planning, some of you are not. And so I'll go through a description of how we go about our planning process in the military. And we have this, I'll do that on the next slide, but basically we wound up differing with the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Report, that by law is required of the Defense Department every 4 years. And it's a look into the future. What's the world going to look like? What are the threats that are out there? What are the sorts of things that the United States generally should be doing in preparation for this? And specifically, what should the Defense Department be doing in preparation for this world that's coming towards us at a very rapid rate? A lot of people have criticized the QDR process as being too apt for generalizations. You know, you can't really predict what the world's going to look like 20 years from now. And a lot of people think that the QDR doesn't have sufficient specificity. One proposal that I think is a pretty good one is that the QDR process should be modified, and we should require that the Defense Department have a 5-year rolling budget that it announces balances. Now, the appropriation is only going to occur year to year, but there would be 5 years of numbers offered by the Pentagon every year, just rolling, that you can look at, and it's concrete descriptions, choices being made concerning how the Pentagon thinks money ought to be spent on our armed forces. That process of coming up with this 5-year budget would require that the Pentagon look out 20 years, 30 years, that sort of thing, because a lot of the platforms and technologies and whatnot that we're trying to develop, recapitalization of our nuclear force, for example, that's decades worth of work. And so it would require that you look out, and then you explain, okay, we've looked out, and we think we ought to be doing these specific things over the next 5 years to prepare for that. So the QDR as it is right now is criticized often as having, it's just sort of a lot of generalisms, not a lot of specificity. But this QDR did get into some specifics, and we'll talk about that. We propose that the QDR be redone. We don't do it in quite that language, but we basically say that we think the administration and Congress should ask the Defense Department to go back and rethink the QDR with a different force posture construct. I'll describe what that force posture construct we come up with is. But even if they use the same force posture construct that they adopted, and I'll explain what the force posture construct, what that concept is. Even if they do that, we think they need to redo it because the process that they went through was too budget informed, budget constrained. We identify Secretary Gates' proposed 2012 budget as the last instance in which, under leadership that was very cost conscious, because Secretary Gates was very aggressive in trying to cut costs in the Defense Department. That's the last instance in which the department has conducted legitimate planning without severe budget constraints, limiting what it wants to do. And so Secretary Gates proposed a baseline projected into the future. We think that's the minimum that the Defense Department should have going off into the future. And I'll show you what the Budget Control Act and sequestration provisions do next. Over time, Congress has limited more and more and more the flexibility of the department to manage its affairs. Just won't let the department do different things. Requires the department to give certain pay raises, certain benefits, keep certain bases open. It goes on and on and on, the extent to which Congress has got its fingers in the weeds as far as management of the Defense Department is concerned. And we think that needs to be reversed. And we particularly think that the restraints on flexibility and management injected by the sequestration provisions is basically all across the board. You can't move money to deal with the situation that you're in. You can't move money to high priority items with funding low priority items. You just can't do that under sequestration. We think that needs to be changed, and then as far as our strategic force is concerned, recapitalization, that would include long-range strike and long-range bombing. We recommend that there be a commission to study that. And those, I think, are the sort of big takeaways from it. Next. I put that up there because it's 3 lines that I might add to an op-ed that I have drafted and submitted to the Post. At least the Post has told me no at this point, and they told publish it. The other thing that's a little different about the National Defense Panel's report is that we look at these budget cuts and we say they are self-defeating for 2 different reasons. One, they increase the likelihood of one kind or another defeat militarily. read into that, more troops killed and wounded. Close. They do that. So they're self-defeating in that way. They're also, oddly enough, and perversely enough, they're self-defeating economically. Why is that? Why, in this attempt to solve our budget woes, we cut expenses, save taxes as a result of cutting those expenses, but ultimately we make our financial situation worse, not better. And it's simply because of the way the world has evolved since the end of World War II. And a lot of folks don't really appreciate this history. But in the first half of the 20th century, we got dragged into a whole bunch of messes. 2 wars that were just awful, just dreadful. World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, which was exacerbated because it became a global phenomenon, and so consequently it's much more difficult to deal with what it was doing here at home. And then, coming out of World War II, we've got the Soviet Union showing up as a totalitarian menace, pushing communism. We've got the prospect of all kinds of continued instability, these sort of festering problems that eventually rise to the level of general war, and we can't stay out of it. We were not entirely isolationist, but we were largely so. We didn't want to be fooling world affairs unless we had to. We had enough things that we wanted to work on right here at home. But the world just wouldn't leave us alone. And finally, our leadership figured out that we can't leave the world alone because it won't leave us alone. And so, largely American leadership is what created the IMF, the World Bank, United Nations, NATO, OAS. We entered into all these agreements with various allies scattered around the globe. And we really led the creation of what is referred to in many circles as a liberal international order. It causes a lot of people to shudder. I'm not in favor of that, said liberal. But it's a rules-based international order that has been hugely helpful to world wealth. The world's wealth today is dramatically higher than it would be without this order. And that means our wealth is dramatically higher than it would be without this order. And the only entity around that is essential to maintaining that order is the United States of America and its diplomatic and military presence globally and activities globally. And the diplomatic stuff, whether it's the United States Institute of Peace, or it's the State Department, or it's USAID, or it's the United Nations, all this kind of stuff, the diplomatic stuff, depends upon a robust, capable, willing, and present military for it to be effective. That's just fact. That's the way the world works right now. And if America retrenches, willingly or just because it's cut its budget so much that it's not able to do what it needs to do. If it retrenches militarily, it's almost guaranteed that we're going to have instability globally rising. You'll have these really destabilizing arms races, particularly in Eurasia. Lots of horsing around by little tin pot dictator types. And the effect of that will be to diminish the world economy, which diminishes our economy, which cuts tax collections even more than what we're saving as a result of these budget cuts to the military. So they're self-defeating in 2 ways. They can lead us to military defeat in one form or another. Not ultimately, but in one form or another. More deaths, more wounded, a longer lead time before we get things stabilized. And they ultimately will cost us money, not save us money. So they're stupid from 2 different perspectives. And the one that's not really emphasized is the second one, the economic one. A lot of people think, well, what are you talking about? You're talking about going to war for oil. The criticism that you heard about Iraq. No, what we're talking about is defending an international status quo that the United States, midwife, that's incredibly important to stability in the world for security reasons and economy. That's what we're talking about defending. And we have the role. It's certainly not a blessing to be in the position that we put ourselves in as a result of all these years. It may be a curse, but it is a fact for the foreseeable future, and it pays for itself. It pays for itself multiple times over. It's really something that we should do, and we're not doing it to give a gift to the world. Our presence and commitment, the money that we spend, the heartache that we bring to families, that benefits other people's, no question. And no question those other peoples ought to be doing more. Our allies should be stepping to the plate more. But it's also no question they can't do it without us. And they probably won't do it without us. They see us step back. Why would they step forward? That's nuts. So we're kind of caught. The world can change. But for the foreseeable future, if the United States is not the leader, it makes it worse for everybody, including us. Resources, etc., to try and figure out what the world's going to look like. And obviously, in order to come up with your national security strategy, you got to have an idea what the world's going to look like. It's going to be Eden. You don't have to say. If it's going to be somewhere in between, then we can have, we're going to have some flexibility, and we have to figure out what we ought to be doing in order to maximize benefits for Americans. From the national security strategy, the Defense Department then comes up with a national defense strategy. And again, that has been remarkably consistent for decades and decades. The entire time I've been alive, I was born in 48. This stuff was created back when I was born.
But how could it be consistent when the players change, their strategy change, the tools that they use change?
It has been remarkably consistent. It's both parties. It doesn't matter which party is controlling the White House, it doesn't matter which party is controlling Congress. And it is true that the names change, and it is true that the threats change, and it is true that we very aggressively work on technological development so that we can be ahead of the world as far as preparedness is concerned. All those things change, but the idea that the United States will provide a leadership role globally, meet its commitments to allies, develop more commitments to allies, encourage others to become allies, that it will support the United Nations, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in trying to maintain world order. That concept has been present. The rest of it winds up being sort of important details, but that basic agreement, that this is our strategy, this is what we're going to do, and all of it is undergirded by robustly funded military. That's been around and hasn't changed. And so that's what I mean by we hasn't really changed all that much yet. Now, where the national defense strategy is concerned, when you get right down to, well, how are we going to organize ourselves militarily, there's this thing they call force, that's changed over the world, over the years, but right now they're calling it force posture concept. So here's what our national defense strategy is. It's, it could be not a whole lot more definite than what I just described to you. It sounds like motherhood and apple pie, what we've been doing for decades, we're still going to do it. The force posture construct is more specific. And since the end of the Cold War, it has basically been that we'll be able to fight and win simultaneously two major contingency operations, which means two major wars in two different places globally, while at the same time continuing to defend the United States. So steady state defense obligations with the United States is concerned. So that's been the forced posture construct. A lot of people would tell you we never actually had the force to meet that construct. But it laid out an ambitious agenda for planners to then, okay, so how's that going to happen? And what they do, and this is a huge number of people, and make their lives doing this, is they take a look at, okay, so where could this war come from? Who would it be? What would be involved? How would we counter it? Well, what do we need in order to counter it? And as you go through the details of that, each of the branches, etc., you get down to specific numbers of ships, mixes of ships, specific aircraft, mixes of aircraft, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that forced posture construct sort of enables more concrete planning. What are we going to do? The forced posture construct, well, we'll talk about that. The Quadrennial Defense Review is mandated by Congress every 4 years, and then the National Defense Council is this independent group that looks at the QDR and makes a recommendation to Congress. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Here's what we would change. Here's what we agree with. Here's what we don't agree with. When people ask me, as a member, as Bill Perry was pretty good at pressing, and he would say, okay, what do you want to accomplish? Go around the table. Boom, boom, boom. 5 general officers, 2 former members of Congress, and 2 defense policy people. Just one of them, Michelle Fuller, worked for Democrats and had defense policy, and Eric Ellison worked for Republicans and had defense policy. Go around the table, get to me, and I would say, pretty consistently, I view this as a platform to get things done. And the thing I would really like to do is hit Congress with a lead-filled baseball bat. So the panel is actually a platform to try and get things done. And obviously we need to do something. We need to reverse the Budget Control Act and sequestration provisions, get more funding into the military. So can we go to the next slide, please? The 2014 QDR, I've already mentioned this term, budget informed. And the explanation for that is we have constrained fiscal circumstances. And so what's the point of going through an exercise of coming up with, dreaming up all these things that you want to have when we don't have the money for it? We know what our top line is going to be. We've already been told. And so it's impractical, it's unrealistic. If you're going to do something that's practical and realistic and has some touchstone in the real world, well then what you're going to do is keep in mind the budget top line. So budget informed. And then this next quote here comes out of the NDP report. Yet the capabilities and capacities rightly called for in the QDR clearly exceed the budget resources made available to the department. So that's been something that people are picking up. You know, the department is saying, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it within these top line numbers. And what we're saying is, within those top line numbers, you can't do what you say you're going to do without a high level of risk. Typically, you're talking about, so here's what we want to do, whatever it is. Here's the force that we need to do it, organized certain ways, etc. At a low level of risk, low to moderate level of risk, moderate level of risk, moderate to high level of risk. And so that's you hear that tossed around fairly constantly. What our comment is, this keeps up, you're not going to be able to do that without a high level of risk. In other words, you're not going to be able to execute national defense strategy. The QDR's forced posture construct I just told you before, what they did was they changed it's kind of interesting. There was a lot of fallout once the QDR came out. Some of you might recall. A lot of people jumped on this forced posture construct as a change from the traditional, since the Cold War, to MCO, major contingency operations. They jumped on it and said, oh, the Obama administration's backing off. Within the Obama administration, they were dismayed. The primary planners, the authors of the QDR, Christine Woman, she came to think about this, and she said, we changed the language. This language is consistent with the 2012 strategic posture guidance, the strategic guidance that we received from NSA, the White House, and the President. But we still think it's two MCOs. Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, back when the two MCO concept came up, he said, look, we've never had the ability to do two MCOs. We didn't have it back then. We don't have it now. So we actually suggested that there be a different force posture construct once the next one. So what we did is assumed reasonable funding. There are a few reasons for that. One is, you're almost quitting ahead of time where Congress is concerned. If you just agree to the top line that they're thinking about, or that they've sort of told you, or the administration has said to stay within, if you think that more needs to be done, you need to tell Congress that more needs to be done. And that's what Congress wants to hear. But if you start out by just staying within those numbers, then Congress gets the signal, oh, we can stay within the numbers. And so we'll stay, we got things are tight. Why should we give the military more money? A lot of ways in the military. So we won't do it. And then we offer this different force posture construct, which basically contemplates, in fact, I wanted to, it basically contemplated doing one MCO, anywhere globally, one MCO. And then what I wanted the panel to agree to was yet another new military act. And it's BTC 2.0. BTC 2.0. Beat the crap out of any other opportunistic aggressor. And the panel can go along with that, but I thought it was pretty good. BTC 2.0. But the basic idea here is that you look at the way the world is evolving. You've got all these characters out there that would love to get forces. If they saw an opportunity to do it, they'd do it in a heartbeat. Iran did it. Putin did it. China did it. They're all over the place. And, yeah.
Recently, I think the chairman that comment about force posture construct. That's something that you discussed. And two went on for me is two is Russia and China. The second two is Iran and North Korea. The third two is the Al-Qaeda and Transnational. And the plus one is that's something that we discussed.
No, we didn't talk about that. I did not. Did everybody hear that? No. So, let's do this.
Yeah, recently the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, made a comment about the force construct posture about 2 + 2 + 2 + 1. The first two is Russia and China. The second two is North Korea and Iran. The third two is Al-Qaeda and transnational organizations. And then the plus one is cyber. So, and that was a discussion that he had made at some whatever think tank, and I just thought perhaps you have taken that as a suggestion on how to do that force construct with our available resources.
Right. So, I suppose you could have a force posture construct like that, looking at specific countries that you think might give you problems, put them in order, and then a specific area that you think could be giving you problems, that sort of thing. That's not what we chose to do. It's not traditionally what is done. That might be something we should consider. I don't know. What we chose to do is stay within the typical boundaries here, not predict who our enemy is going to be, but be prepared to defeat somebody flat out, regime change, occupation, what have you. And then be prepared to deter aggressors, and then have all of the abilities that you need to have in order to be confident that you're going to be able to do that. Which would mean you got to have cyber, you got to be prepared to deal with Al-Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're getting to the same place. He's suggesting that maybe there be a different force posture construct. We are also. One of the things that we said was we think our force posture construct, it better fits today's world than the 2MCO thing does. But we don't have, and let's assume Congress winds up agreeing, or in the defense part, everybody agrees. Then you take the force posture construct and you go from there to try and figure out what you need to be spending money on. And that requires huge analytic ability. It's way beyond the panel's capabilities. There are only 10 of us, and a small staff. And we're pretty experienced, breadth of experience. They used to describe the panel as having 5 general officers who, for the most part, had huge depth and no breadth, because they had their individual areas where they really were total experts. They'd forgotten so much stuff that most of us would ever know. And then you had Eric Edelman and Michelle Flournoy and Bill Perry, who had huge breadth and depth. Then you had me and Jim Town, lots of breadth, no depth. But we certainly don't have the analytic ability to take the force posture construct and turn it into numbers. You've got to really think that through. Okay, so if this happens, that happens. In order to turn it into numbers where you can say with a certain degree of confidence, we can execute the force posture construct, we can meet the force posture construct and execute the national defense strategy. Okay, so next slide. In the QDR, the word innovation is used over and over and over and over again. And so in an early draft of the Defense Panel's report, I had put in the innovation agenda as if somehow harder work and better talent going to get you out of this funding mess. But it was much more snippy. And one of my fellow panelists said, "Oh, we really think we need to say that." So we did. But it is the latest buzzword, and that's all it is. Generations of people have been smart. Generations of people have worked hard, been creative, etc. It almost insults them to suggest that they weren't, and that somehow innovation is going to solve our problems. But there is no question that the United States military edge for decades now has been provided by technology. We've just been ahead of everybody else. I remember in Vietnam, I got to look through a starlight scope a couple of times. And looking through a starlight scope, you might be able to see there was a door over there. But that's about it. It was really pretty hazy. I was embedded with an A-team, Special Forces A-team, for 3 days. A village called Cong along the Pakistan border. And at one point, I did get an opportunity to look through the current version of this starlight scope, our night vision goggles. Unbelievable. I mean, it's like night and day. And I remember Billy Joel's song, "We rule the day and they rule the night." That anti-war Vietnam song, some of you might recall. And I thought, well, that's changed. We completely rule the night now because they can't see. We can't. Well, that's going to change. People are getting night vision goggles. They're catching up on a lot of different things. Shoulder-fired missiles to take out aircraft. It's routine for bad guys to have that stuff now. We invented it. And so we think it's terribly important that the United States continue its investments in technologies that enable us to be dominant militarily. And that the rest of the world's trying to catch up. Doesn't mean we should slow down. We just need to run harder. We have the blessing of being very creative in this country. I don't know what it is, but we're about the most creative country in the world. Just a combination of circumstances, and maybe to stop, an awful lot of us have a lot of get up and go, because that's obviously our fortress sector, because they got up and went wherever they were, came here, except the Native population, they kind of came here too. So anyway, the technological edge winds up being very important. Next slide. And then we have these specific improvement priorities that could be of interest to some in this room. It might be given business that touches upon those. And I won't read it. Give you just a chance to take a look at it. But it's in the National Defense Panel report. And I think there might be an opportunity for Robbins right here in some of this stuff. Talk about that for you. Next. Who cares about that? So, Army guy. So the QDR comes up with 440 to 450 active duty soldiers. Let's go ahead and go to. Let's go to the next slide. And for Marines, 182. Next slide. NDP. 490, 182. Let me explain how we got there. I told you just a little while ago, we just said we don't have the analytic capability to come up with what it should be. What's the answer? What we recommend to Congress is that the Defense Department be detailed to go back through the planning process and do a plan that isn't so extremely budget constrained. And then we say, and if it did that, we think it might conclude these things. So we're just tossing this out based on experience, based upon trends, et cetera, et cetera. We interviewed an awful lot of people in the course of putting our report together. So we're probably not too far off the mark. Next slide. Navy. This is what the QDR says. It's not very specific about much at all. Navy typically talks about end strength in terms of numbers of ships. Next slide. What we say is that the Navy is currently on this trajectory to have 260 ships or less. The goal here should be between 323 and 346 ships for the Navy. This is all affordable, by the way. It's all a question of choice. The country just needs to make a decision. And that question is above the pay grade of the Defense Department. It's with Congress and the President. It's with the politicians. It's a matter of choice, not affordability. Next. Air Force. Again, not really very specific. I went ahead and gave the entire description because I knew the audience that I was going to be talking to. So in the QDR, this is what the Defense Department says the Air Force is going to be doing over the next few years. Everybody got that? Everybody want to raise their hand and say, slow reader. Next slide. This is what we say. The Air Force outfields the smallest and oldest force of combat aircraft in its history and needs a global surveillance and strike force able to rapidly deploy theaters of operation to deter, defeat, and punish multiple aggressors simultaneously. The panel therefore recommends increasing the number of manned and unmanned aircraft capable of conducting what ISR and long-range strikes in contested airspace. We don't. Air Force tends to talk in terms of platforms also. Let's talk about instruments. And we didn't come up with a number. At one point, in an earlier draft, the number that we proposed was a minimum increase of 1,000 in compensated towards driving another 550. We think it should increase. And the mixture, we were pretty specific about what sort of mixture we thought might make sense. And we also think that a lot of this is going to be unmanned, that we are headed more and more toward remotely piloted aircraft that use what Norton Schwartz refers. But anyway, there was a dispute between two critical key panel members, and they came up with this language, which I guess is okay, but I would have preferred to have a reference to a specific target. Because we're just pulling all this stuff out anyway, right? We already said we don't have the ability to really do this, but we think this might happen. That might be the conclusion of the appropriate thing to decide. Let me just comment briefly before we talk about this about affordability. So, Constitution, Congress must provide details. Maybe these other things. When you go ahead and concede that we're going to stay within the top line of the current crowd of politicians we're talking about, you're sort of accepting this notion that, well, one thing, back off, where recapitalization of our strategic forces are concerned, so the nuclear forces, the estimate is that that can cost as much as $1 trillion over a 30-year period of time. And people just start shuddering. And my comment to the panel was that we cannot afford, the United States can't afford $1 trillion over a 30-year period of time. We've got bigger problems than we even vaguely think we have. I mean, that is easily affordable. It's a question of choice. So in the discussion, in the panel's report, what you'll see is recapitalization, the expense associated with recapitalization will likely come from needed improvements to conventional. Will likely come from needed improvements to conventional. So as a panel member, I strike out will likely come and put in should not come. And then I explain to my fellow panelists, hey, we're conceding defeat to start out with. We think this should be done. It's clearly affordable. It's a matter of choice. The choice isn't just within the top line. The choice is, got all this money, the federal government collects, is available to expend programs. What's your biggest priority? And we think that the defense, the Constitution suggests that, doesn't mandate it. Defense has a higher priority. And so the funding to recapitalize the nuclear force doesn't have to come from defense. So you shouldn't say it. By saying should not, you recognize the possibility that it could. So that's the sort of level of detail that we got into as we were doing our report. I lost that one, by the way. So there were 2 or 3 people who were sort of, Sam Nunn and George Schultz and a few others are involved in this net zero effort. Let's get rid of the nukes altogether. And that's nice. It would be nice. That's not, I think, the world we live in, or we'll be living in. And hence, I mean, it'd be great to be able to do that. So where affordability is concerned, we should be staying in the top line. We should be looking at other government programs. Healthcare is a great example of opportunity to save tons of dollars in restructuring healthcare appropriately. And even within the Defense Department, you can do a lot to limit waste where healthcare is. And then I thought what we might do is talk about possible opportunities and challenges. I tossed out that first one because as I was kicking around ideas with my fellow panelists and others, ideas for what I might talk about here at Robbins. And I would ask people specifically, well, what do you think Robbins' opportunities are? And one person said that Center of Excellence for Joint STARS replacement and next generation ISR C2 command and control and battle management systems. Now, they're already doing that kind of stuff at Langley. I don't know where else. got the EW, Electronic Warfare Center of Excellence, for the Air Force here. And for a while there, at least when I was in Congress, I was talking about let's make it the Center of Excellence for DOD, for all the branches here at Rogers, where EW was concerned. So I don't know, any thoughts about, yes?
Was there any discussion about?
Right here.
So the recommendation to stay globally engaged will lead to the need to be able to get our troops there or bring them back, refresh them. That goes to global transport. So airlift, was that discussed much in the NDP?
Yes and no. You'll find a passage, I think I will, but you'll find something that talks about we need to be globally present, not back here in the United States. People need to see us. And we need to be in a position, so we need to have pre-code equipment that we've been doing for years. And we need to have forces out there that are prepared to deal with the initial wave. And then, you know, people are thinking about attacking you. They see that you're prepared to deal with it, then they don't attack you. But basically, initial wave of attack. And then, and to be able to take care of the deal until reinforcements come. And so it's a combination of providing supplies, people, etc. And in that sense, we've got to have a strategic way to accomplish that.
So airlift being a big thing in a lot.
Right. Right. Not to be better.
Yes, sir. Now that you brought up with the Joint Stars platform, and I'm part of that membership with the J-Stars out there. I know that we're going through certain cuts and losing some of the aircraft that we manage there. Is there any future as far as new platform for that directly? I know we've been seriously tasked here in the States and all over the world with that particular platform, and has done some pretty great things. Losing additional 5 aircraft I know of, definitely I see as a member would definitely impact what you talked about, being in that forefront of security for our country and our allies. Any more direct discussion on, I know Boeing had proposed a different platform, and directly cost-wise, our systems out there are getting pretty old. It takes a lot of money to run those.
Right.
Just talk about
Well, as some here will recall, in the last decade or so, we've back and forth on re-engineering, that sort of thing. And then there's been some discussion of replacing the platform altogether. And then that discussion wound up being would there be a really dramatic change, getting enhanced capabilities where IT is concerned, boxes are getting smaller and smaller, and whatnot. By remote piloted aircraft, much smaller aircraft, what you're talking about, outfitting King Airs to do a lot of the stuff that starts with. But the answer to your question, at the panel level, we're not confident really in that level of decision. So this is really high level stuff, and we know that in the current budget, the Air Force is being forced to make very difficult funding decisions. They're cutting different things that they might prefer to keep. But sadly, the biggest thing that Joint Stars owns should be the military. It should be the Army. The Army and Marines should be the ones saying, "What? You think about that? Those guys, they were great. They help us out enormously." But the Air Force, maybe doesn't have the exact same view of the importance of Joint Stars as, say, a Joint Force would have. Joint Stars. So, but back to that level of detail,
Sir, Doug Mason with Georgia Tech. A startling projection in your report is that the number of aircraft in the Air Force between now and 2019 will decrease excess of infrastructure and capacity in some areas now, then that exacerbates the situation for potentially Rollins and Forest. Should we be looking at bringing new missions into Rollins vis-a-vis your second subway?
So, on the current budgetary track, there is going to be a reduction in number of platforms. I think ours is 5. I can't recall precisely. In the report, and this is applicable practice, in the report we do recognize, we do notice the Defense Department's recent studies suggesting that there's 20% excess capacity in facilities within the United States and globally. We cut out. One of the things we object to is constantly closing bases to foreign lands. We got to stop that process. Once you close it, getting it back could be a real problem. And for any number of reasons, if you're going to have a global presence, you've got to have bases agreements, overflights, all that kind of stuff. But we do have 20% excess capacity here in the continental United States. And so we do recommend that in another private process, we offer a suggestion for how support for that might be gotten, because Congress is pretty weary of doing another BRAC. They look at the last BRAC, projections for savings, and say the savings weren't anything like the projections that were offered to Congress. They look at the last BRAC and they say that the Defense Department wound up sneaking in an awful lot of reorganizations in the name of base realignment and closing, and that Congress does its best to pretty unhappy about that, felt like they didn't do this well. And then the final thing is most members of Congress, at least in the House, the members who serve on the Readiness Committee, people like me, it makes sense for me to be on armed services, maybe given my background. But my background was just a tactical level, for a couple of years. And it was great. I survived. It really taught me a lot, but it didn't give me a big perspective on things. And so why would I get on the Armed Services Committee? There were people teaching law with me for 16 years. I learned from there. They didn't even know I'd been in the Army Department and stuff. But I had a finance background. I'm a real expert with that kind of stuff. I should have been on financial services. Why was I on armed services? Because job number one, the member from this district, is Robbins Air Force Base. Period. Dot, exclamation. That is job number one. So Robbins Air Force Base is my job. What's my job? It's to keep Robbins open and growing and happy. And so people want to do BRAC. I don't want to do BRAC. I'm representing my folks. BRAC makes sense that they think that I want to do BRAC. Kind of thing. So you run into that where Congress is concerned. Having said that, Congress is leery, but times are tight, and you've got to expect that in the next few years there will be a serious move for another BRAC process, and you've just got to be ready for it. And bringing new missions, absolutely. Diversifying the base, supporters for the base, absolutely. And I'm interested in a general conversation about that.
Requested you get a copy of the slides.
I think you've got it. Can you distribute it?
We'll check into it.
Yeah, I mean, get it to,
Yeah. If we've got it, we can help.
We get it, usually.
We'll do that.
One
All right.
Century Museum.
okay, that. Other,
You talk about it.
I'll talk about it. Just a question. I had an opportunity to attend several years ago the National Security Forum that was over at Maxwell. And we were talking about the U.S. provides a host of services to many countries around the world. Definitely need a global presence. We need a strong military. We need to be in those areas. We provide manpower, technology, provide equipment, monitoring of space. We always in all these countries, and we have bases in a lot of those countries that they charge us to be in their country, basically. bill us, we pay the people. When we are gonna stop operating the United States like we did in the 90s, we did in the 60s? We have a larger footprint now. When are we gonna start billing those countries for our services? We wanna be there, but the U.S. American citizens, we're providing the cost. And the reason our budget keeps going up, deficit keeps going up, because we're billing the taxpayers to provide that security, technology, manpower in those countries. And it's time that we start moving different from a business standpoint, business side.
So your voice is a very commonly heard voice out there today. And there is no question, as I said earlier, and as we say in the defense panel's report, our allies can and should do more. How so? Well, how about paying for some things? How about you step up and take care of this security issue so that we don't have to worry about it? Those sorts of things. These are conversations that we've had with our allies for decades. We're going to continue to have those conversations. It is absolutely clear that if we pull back, they are not going to step forward. So if we want our allies to be stepping up and doing different things, including funding stuff, we got to be out there. And the budget cuts mean almost certainly that we're not going to be out there. So that's one thing. The other thing is, back to one of those earlier slides, it's not a lesson. It might be a curse, but it is a fact. Over a 70-year period of time, we sort of led the world to a point where we're this integral feature in the world that keeps things calm. If things don't stay calm, lots of economic studies show this, by the way. We've really got a pretty sophisticated model for issues of this sort. If things don't stay calm, what happens is the economy gets screwed up. And we're not. We are so, the world is so interdependent now economically, and very poorly integrated, but very interdependent economically. And so crunches us. And when we get crunched, it means tons of people lose jobs. A lot of people commit suicide. It's just awful. Divorces, etc. The things that happen in depression. The things that happened recently as a result of the financial collapse. Well, the collapse you would see globally, if there was really significant increase in violence, makes the financial collapse pale in comparison. And so we're in this Hobson's choice. I mean, we back off to try and save money. What we actually wind up doing is costing ourselves more money in the long run. So yeah, they should do more, and we should be pressuring them to do that. And it is this, it's one of these deals. It's like we're providing a common good, and a lot of people out there should be paying for it, but we don't have a way of taxing them to do that. But we are providing a good to the world, but we are doing it. The benefit to us, let's put it this way, the benefit to us of providing this good far outweighs the costs to us of providing the good. Would we like to cover more of those costs with some of these other people who are freeloaders? Absolutely. We should continue to work to do that. So that's the response. And I think everybody needs to give that response, because that's a real common voice that you're hearing right now. And that's a voice that leads us to retrench, leads us towards dropping military spending, and leads us towards having all kinds of security issues, and then also a lesser economy. Yes?
Yes, sir. Just one quick comment on the question. The quick comment is that there are countries that are paying significant amounts of money to assist us in particular in the Pacific. Both Japan and Korea shell out a lot of money for base facilities and for maintenance of our equipment. And it's not well known.
Middle East.
Yeah.
We do that, right?
Yeah. It's not well known because nobody wants to talk about it, but it is happening.
Yeah.
But the second thing is the classic way you described how we go through our process of figuring out what we need to have and force structure has kind of a classic nation-state context. We expect that we're going to be in a diplomatic, economic, and military environment together. We're using described in the last 60 or 70 years. The problem, though, is that we're now seeing the emergence of things that don't quite fit that model, with things like ISIS and with adversaries, perhaps like China, where you really don't know what's an unacceptable cost. And the phrase that you put in there is exactly right. You choose to do whatever is necessary to exact that cost so the end.
Right close to me.
Okay,
We can't hear
but
you.
in the case of ISIS or in the case of China, those things are kind of unknown.
So, if you read the report, you'll see that we recognize the very reality that you just described. And the fact of the matter is, things are changing very rapidly. The world is not getting safer. All of these non-state actors make things more difficult to, prediction-wise, and it's more difficult to deal with. How do you deal with these kinds of threats? And so we acknowledge that. It's one of the points that we make in saying this is not a time to be cutting defense spending. It's a time to be increasing defense spending. And the other point is that since things are it's so unpredictable and uncertain exactly what capabilities and sector we're going to need, that we really ought to be in the mindset of having too much. Because you don't want to get into a situation where you need it and you don't have it. So, again, that's another reason, the uncertainties that are out there, another reason why we should be upping defense spending, not increasing.
Question here.
Yes, sir. In addition to hardware, did the panel address issues around people and supporting them?
Yes, but very brief section on military pay and compensation. There are differences of opinion here. I think that the right side of it has the military pay and compensation, and the civilian workforce, particularly in Washington. There's hundreds of thousands of people passing papers, analyzing this, reading what somebody else analyzed, and shuffling it back and forth. That there's a fair amount of waste associated with that. As far as pay and compensation benefits, et cetera, are concerned, we've got a military compensation commission out there right now. And so we simply say in the report that we applaud the creation of the commission. It was recommended in the last panel's report. That commission is really staffed up lots of things, like 120 employees, a pretty substantial budget. What we hope is that the commission will come up with recommendations concerning pay and benefits that will give us the quality force that we need in a very cost-efficient way. And we leave it to them to do so. But we do know that Congress has routinely stepped in and done, from my perspective, really stupid stuff that has increased costs. And so we basically, we don't say that, but we basically say that we hope Congress will heed what they say and actually go along with it. Another example of not getting exactly what you want, in that section, we call for Congress to hold a vote on the Commission's recommendation. And I cut that out and said something like, just support it. And effectually, the Commission's recommendation. And I have a little note saying, Congress is not going to vote on the Commission's recommendation. Somebody has to create legislation that is in furtherance of the recommendation, and then there'll be a vote maybe on that legislation, but there's not going to be a vote on the Commission's recommendation. Somehow that bad. You would think I somehow the old language is still other questions, comments. Well, I appreciate very much what so we talked about the got the about 8 months. And so it's a perfect setting. Totally happy with that, but how I handled it. What I did was, I had a helmet, but then if somebody wanted to ask me a question or make a statement or something like that, I had a mic. And I would walk down, you didn't walk around. I walked around, and I could get right up close to them, and I'd give them the mic. They have to say what they're going to say, and be right next to them. Instead of 60 yards away. And you tend not to get quite as carried away.
The question that Jim and I talked about when we came in was, we collectively agreed that the circumstance we find ourselves in with sequestration, with the circumstance of funding, is total failure in government leadership. And the question I posed to Jim then was, where is that leadership going to come from to get us out of this mess? It's not going to come from the executive branch. It's not going to come, at least here, not to come from either House or the Senate. So where does the leadership generate to find our way through this mess, to make the tough decisions that eventually the Congress will have to work through? The executive branch will have to work through. But right now, there doesn't appear to be any meaningful leadership to get us out of this mess. And I asked Jim to just respond to that.
Yeah, you sort of look at, if you're from afar, where Congress is concerned, and Washington generally is concerned, and you look at what's going on, it almost seems as like they're just day to day. It's like one crisis after the other. Just run and stop what you see. And you wonder whether or not there are any adults out there who are kind of like not getting very rushing to the people who make it on TV, for the most part, are people who want to say the most extreme things, because that's the viewers will continue to watch the TV as a result of that. So you get this impression that the place is just covered up. Lack of depth, maturity, adulthood. And it does have those kinds of problems, but it is also the case that you've got a very steady, large group of both staff and members, House and Senate, who are very concerned about the very thing that the National Defense Panel is talking about. We're hoping that the defense panel's work will add to the debate, push it in a good direction. I don't think we're going to see a lot, unless we have some, it's sad to say, unless we have some military crisis that's worse than, Ukraine. It's just terrible stuff that you see going on right now. Unless we have that, it's hard for me to see between now and the presidential election, 2000, a lot of movement. But maybe we will, because there is a real pressure to people are saying, readiness alone is really hurting. And there are plenty of studies that show that if you deal with your readiness issues now, it costs you a lot less than letting them fester and build more and then have to deal with it later. And so, where's the leadership going to come from? We got plenty of people who are talking about this and want to see this happen. We lend some way. We'll do what we can with op-eds. We'll have panel presentations, heritage, AEI, all these places we'll do and stuff. And it's just how our system works. I think that they made a really bad judgment thinking they could force themselves to deal with our debt problems by using the BCA and sequestration. Now they don't know how to get out of that. Yes,
Thank you, sir. The gentleman's question touched on some of the stuff that I was recently thinking, but let me answer the question. Oh, I'm sorry. It seems to me, if I jump right out in the middle of the bubble, the economic argument is pretty strong. Certainly would think anybody in Congress that is near military installation that represents the probably agree with that too. Should that be a pretty strong plank, if not maybe the main plank as we go forward?
Yeah.
A lot of people would listen to that.
Yeah. I had I was keeping my fingers crossed that I could keep finding along those lines into the report. Because it's a real fine line to walk here, because you're going to have right away people saying, oh, you're talking about we just go to war with profit. It's not war with profit. Okay? I've written an op-ed, I mentioned that earlier, that I'm hoping the Post will publish, and I was hoping that my buddy Jim would join me in that op-ed. He and I also authored another op-ed that I joined him in. We submitted to the Post. I told him I did not think the Post was going to print this op-ed, that he should join me in one that I had written, because I thought the Post might print it, because it added to the debate. And what Jim didn't want to do, and I can understand this, is get into that sticky wicket, and, right out of the gate where the National Defense Report is concerned, because the report has so much more. And so what we did, and I agree with it, what we did is we put together something that sort of said what the report said. And not surprisingly, the Post wasn't interested in publishing that, because lots of people would say what the report said. We say it in a different way. We say it was some strength, we got credibility, bipartisan, pretty good background, that sort of thing. We got the credential, national defense, we're appointed by Congress, that sort of thing. But it's not anything new. So I'm going to go ahead and try to publish an article that talks about that. I'm very recently described. It's not out. I want more members of Congress to understand that, talk about it, and say, hey, this would stuff. Not only are we weakening our armed forces and increasing the likelihood of defeat on the battlefield, but in addition, we're shooting ourselves in the foot economically. That would be a nice thing to add.
Something like more jobs and more.
Well, it's avoiding harm. It's not that we're going out there, we're going to muscle up defense because it's good for jobs in the United States. We're going to go attack some other country because, that's how we get out of depression in the United States. We go into World War II, that kind of thing. It's not that at all. It's that it's back to that. It's not a blessing. It might be a curse, but it is a fact. The way the world is right now, we withdraw, we retrench substantially militarily. You're going to see an economic collapse that's going to be devastating for the United States economy. So it's trying to protect what we got. It's not trying to get more. Why don't we call it quits? We've lost half the audience, which is fine. I'm going to stick around, chat, private conversations, not so public, and I guess.
Thank you, Congressman. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming down and sharing some of those enlightening remarks with us. One thing I'd like to share with you about the Congressman, some of you probably don't know, is recently he was named as one of the 100 most influential people in the United States.
It was in the world, but it was a British group, and it was, I was one of the most influential people in the world, 100 most influential in armed violence reduction. Here I am advocating more money for defense.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned. Thank you for being here.